It is dawn on a damp field in the heart of Europe. The year is 1815. Thick, wet fog clings to the ground, obscuring the tens of thousands of men gathered there. Through the mist, a sound begins, not of voices, but of drums, a rhythmic, pulsing beat. And then a colour emerges, not the green of the fields or the grey of the mist, but a brilliant, shocking red. It advances in perfect, disciplined lines, a wall of crimson tipped with the cold silver glint of steel bayonets. This is the British infantry, the Redcoat. For over 200 years, this was the sight that defined the British Empire. From the fields of Flanders to the plains of India, the jungles of North America to the deserts of Africa, the British soldier was known by one thing above all else: his bright red coat. It seems like tactical suicide, a glaring, shoot-me target in an age of gunpowder. Why would a professional, world-conquering army deliberately dress its men in the most visible colour imaginable? The common myth, the one repeated in countless books and films, is that the red was chosen to hide the sight of blood. A simple, brutal piece of battlefield psychology. A man, wounded and bleeding, would not panic his comrades. This myth is just that, a myth. While a wounded soldier might have drawn some small comfort from the colour, the truth is that bloodstains on the thick, dark red wool would quickly turn a blackish brown, just as visible as on any other colour. The real reasons for the red coat were not born from a desire to hide the horrors of war, but from the hard, practical realities that created it. The story of the redcoat is not a story of romance. It is a story of economics. It is a story of brutal battlefield command, and it is a story of terrifying, calculated psychology. To understand why the British soldier wore red, we must first dispense with our modern notions of warfare. We must forget camouflage, sniper rifles, and smokeless powder. We must travel back to a time when war was fought shoulder to shoulder, in dense, choking clouds of smoke, by men wielding weapons that were wildly inaccurate beyond 100 paces. This is the story of how the cheapest dye in England became the most feared uniform on earth. How a simple colour became a tactical tool, a psychological weapon, and the enduring symbol of a global empire. We will debunk the legends and uncover the surprising, interconnected truths behind the most iconic uniform in military history, the British Redcoat. We must begin, not on a foreign battlefield, but in England itself, in the midst of a bloody civil war, where a new kind of army was being forged. An army that needed to be clothed, supplied, and above all, standardized. The choice its leader made, based on a simple invoice, would dictate the colour of British warfare for the next 2 centuries. The birth of the Redcoat had nothing to do with tactics, and everything to do with the treasury. It was 1645, and Oliver Cromwell, a cavalry commander of grim and practical purpose, was building his new model army. This was to be a professional national force, the first of its kind in England. It would be funded by Parliament, not by a wealthy lord. And it needed a uniform. Cromwell's quartermasters, tasked with clothing thousands of new recruits, sought out the most practical, durable, and, crucially, the cheapest bolts of cloth available. They found their answer not in expensive blues or greens, but in vast quantities of English wool dyed with a plant called madder. Madder root produced a dull, brick red, or sometimes slightly orangish colour. It was cheap to grow, easy to process, and the dye was colour fast, meaning it wouldn't run or fade easily after months of hard campaigning. And so, the new model army was issued its first uniform, a long coat of this Venetian red. The Redcoat was born not in a flash of strategic brilliance, but in an act of simple, pragmatic accounting. This economic reality would define the British Army for the next 200 years. The vast majority of the King's infantry, the privates and corporals who did the marching and the dyeing, would wear this cheaper, duller, madder red coat. But not all red was created equal. As the army evolved from a Civil War necessity into the professional tool of a burgeoning empire, a clear visual divide emerged, a tale of 2 distinct reds. The madder-dyed red of Cromwell's infantry was the colour of the common soldier. It was practical, durable, and mass-produced. But the army's officers, gentlemen who purchased their own commissions and their own uniforms, would not be seen in the same drab cloth as their men. They, along with the elite guard regiments in London, wore scarlet. This was the iconic, vibrant, almost impossibly bright red that we picture today. This scarlet was not derived from a common plant, but from a tiny exotic insect, the cochineal. Harvested by the thousands in the New World, these beetles were crushed to create a dye of unparalleled brilliance and staggering cost. A coat dyed with cochineal was a status symbol. It was a mark of wealth and standing, as much a part of the officer's social uniform as his battlefield one. On campaign, this visual distinction was immediate. The enlisted men formed the dull brick-red line, while the officers and sergeants stood out, resplendent in their expensive scarlet, making them easy to identify, for their own men and for the enemy. This division created the first layer of battlefield identification. But it also created a much larger problem. As the British Army grew, it was no longer enough to simply distinguish officer from private. Generals now commanded multiple regiments on a single field, and from a distance, one mass of red looked exactly like another. Imagine a general on a hilltop, a mile from the fighting. He looks through his spyglass at a sea of red uniforms, all vanishing into a dense, impenetrable cloud of smoke. How does he send orders? How does he know which regiment is advancing, which is faltering, and which must be moved to plug a gap in the line? The army was a vast red machine, but it was a machine with interchangeable and indistinguishable parts. This problem of friendly fire and command confusion was solved with a brilliant, simple, and elegant solution. The answer was not to change the coat, but to accessorize it. This solution was formally codified in the Royal Warrant of 1751, a sweeping set of regulations that standardized the look of the British Army for the next century. The warrant mandated that while all infantry regiments would wear red coats, each regiment would be distinguished by its own unique facing colour. The facings were the colours of the cuffs, the collars, and the lapels, which were turned back to reveal the lining. Suddenly, the sea of red was broken by flashes of vibrant, distinct colour. The 1st Regiment, the Royals, wore blue facings. The 3rd Regiment became known simply as the Buffs for their distinctive buff-coloured facings. The 6th Regiment wore a deep yellow, later a primrose. The 31st wore green. Now, a general looking through his spyglass could see not just a red line, but a red line with a blue cuff, or a red line with a yellow collar. He could tell, even through the haze, that it was the 3rd Regiment holding the farmhouse, and the 6th that needed to be moved from the reserve. It was a simple, visual language of command, an 18th century identify friend or foe system painted onto the men themselves. This system became the heart of regimental identity. Men fought and died not just for the king, but for the Buffs or the Green Howards. The facings were more than just a tactical tool. They were a source of immense pride, a tribal marker that bound a unit together. But this system of facings, and the red coat itself, was only necessary because of the way these men were expected to fight. The uniform was not designed for an individual. It was designed for a formation. And this formation was dictated entirely by the crude, brutal, and deeply flawed weapon that every soldier carried in his hands. The weapon that defined the Redcoat era was officially known as the Pattern 1722 Infantry Land Service musket. But to the men who carried it, drilled with it, and cursed it, it was known by one name, the Brown Bess. This single weapon dictated the entire science of 18th and 19th century warfare. It was a smoothbore, flintlock musket, weighing over 10 pounds and measuring nearly 5 feet long with its bayonet fixed. It was a simple, rugged, and reliable piece of technology. It was also wildly, astonishingly inaccurate. A smoothbore musket had no rifling, no spiral grooves on the inside of the barrel to spin the lead ball. The musket ball, often smaller than the barrel to allow for faster loading, would literally bounce its way out, making its path almost random. Drill manuals of the day were brutally honest. A soldier was not expected to hit a single man at 200 yards. He was lucky to hit a formation of men at that range. beyond 80 to 100 yards. Aiming at an individual was an exercise in futility. This technological limitation made the modern idea of camouflage completely useless. What was the point of hiding if the enemy couldn't hit you reliably anyway? And more importantly, what was the point of firing at an enemy you couldn't see? The Brown Bess was not a rifleman's weapon. It was a tool for delivering massed shock. Since no single soldier could be relied upon to hit a target, generals relied on hundreds of soldiers firing at the same time. The goal was not to create a wall of lead, but a wall of lead. This gave birth to linear tactics. The primary formation of the British Army was the thin red line, a formation just 2 or 3 ranks deep. This long, shallow line allowed the maximum number of muskets, the maximum firepower, to be brought to bear on the enemy at once. The soldier was not trained to be a marksman. He was trained to be a cog in a machine. He was drilled relentlessly, not in aiming, but in loading. The platoon exercise was a brutal, repetitive ballet of 12 distinct motions. Handle cartridge, prime, load, draw ramrod, ram down cartridge, return ramrod. A proficient soldier could fire 3, perhaps 4, rounds a minute. When the order to fire came, it was not by individual choice, it was by a single crashing volley. Hundreds of muskets would discharge at once, sending a devastating sheet of lead into the opposing line, 60 or 70 yards away. And this is where the Redcoat became a critical tactical tool. The entire effectiveness of a volley depended on the line's integrity. It had to be straight, perfectly dressed, and shoulder to shoulder. If the line buckled, if men bunched up or spread too far apart, the volley would be ragged and ineffective. This is where the NCOs, the sergeants with their scarlet coats and pole-mounted halberds, became essential. They marched behind the line, using their weapons to physically dress the ranks, pushing men forward, pulling them back, keeping that perfect, unwavering wall. The officers, also in their distinct scarlet, stood ahead of or behind the line, their voices straining to be heard over the din. In the chaos of battle, with men falling and the line wavering, the red uniform was the primary tool of command and control. It allowed officers and sergeants to instantly see their own men, to spot gaps, and to maintain the disciplined formation that was the army's only path to victory. The uniform was not for hiding, it was for cohesion. But there was another, even more disorienting element of the battlefield that made the red coat not just useful, but absolutely essential, a technological byproduct of the Brown Bess that would shroud the world in a thick, artificial fog. The technological byproduct was black powder. Every time a Brown Bess musket or a 6-pounder cannon was fired, it unleashed not just a projectile, but a cloud of thick, dense, sulphurous smoke. Now multiply that by tens of thousands. With the first mass volleys, the battlefield would simply disappear. Within minutes, a suffocating artificial fog, acrid and stinging, would roll across the field, reducing visibility to a few dozen feet, sometimes less. The fog of war was not a metaphor. It was a physical, choking, blinding reality. The air, thick with the smell of sulphur, would be filled with the screams of the wounded and the unending rhythmic crash of cannon and musket. Soldiers would later describe their faces and hands becoming caked in a black, greasy soot from biting open the paper cartridges and from the powder's discharge. In this self-created hell, an army could be deafened, blinded, and disoriented all at once. And this is the single most important tactical reason for the bright red coat. In this white-grey nightmare, the red uniform was a beacon. It was the only way for a general to command his army. From his vantage point on a nearby hill, a commander like the Duke of Wellington wasn't watching individual soldiers. He was watching massive, brightly coloured blocks of red, blue, or white as they manoeuvred through the smoke. He used his spyglass to find his regimental flags, the massive sacred colours, and the flash of red and the distinct facing colours of the units holding them. This was how he directed the battle, identifying his buffs or his royals and dispatching mounted aides de camp with new orders. On the line itself, the situation was even more desperate. Vocal commands were impossible, drowned out by the thundering crash of the volleys. The only way to manoeuvre was by the constant beat of the regimental drums, A long roll might signal advance, while another beat would signal form square. But how could a soldier follow a drum beat if he couldn't see his unit? The red coat was his anchor. In the chaos, a private would fix his eyes on the red back of the man in front of him. An officer, trying to dress the line for the next volley, would peer through the smoke for the red flashes of his company, screaming for them to close the gaps. The uniform was the visual glue holding the entire line together. Without it, a regiment would dissolve. It would scatter into a confused, terrified rabble, lost in the smoke, deafened by the noise, and unable to find its own officers or colours. It would be overrun and slaughtered. The red coat, therefore, was not a liability. It was an essential piece of 18th century technology. It was a command and control system, as vital to victory as the musket or the cannon. It allowed the British Army to remain a single, cohesive fighting machine in conditions that were designed to tear it apart. This unparalleled visibility, this ability to stay in formation when others broke, fed into the Army's most famous and most feared tactical formation. A formation that was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one, and it was a formation that would earn the British infantry a new legendary nickname. This unparalleled visibility, this ability to stay in formation when others broke, fed into the Army's most famous and most feared tactical formation, a formation that was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. And it was a formation that would earn the British infantry a new legendary nickname, the Thin Red Line. While continental armies, particularly the French, often favoured attacking in dense, deep columns to punch through an enemy line with sheer weight and shock, the British perfected the opposite. They trusted their men to stand in a line just 2, sometimes 3 ranks deep. To an attacker, this formation looked fragile, thin, and easily broken. It was a gamble that relied entirely on 2 things: the discipline of the men and the volume of their firepower. The Thin Red Line was a formation designed not to charge, but to receive a charge. It was a massive linear firing squad, and the red coat was the key to its psychological dominance. Imagine you are a French conscript, part of a massive column advancing across a field. You are marching shoulder to shoulder, 20, 30, even 40 men deep. Your officers are screaming, drums are beating, you are shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" You are a surging, chaotic, passionate mass of blue, and in front of you, on a slight ridge, is a silent, unmoving line. It is not a mob. It is a perfect, straight wall of red. It does not shout. It does not wave its flags. It simply stands and waits. This wall of red was a calculated piece of psychological warfare. The human brain is hardwired to associate the colour red with danger, with power, with dominance. That advancing wall of crimson, topped with gleaming bayonets, looked unnatural, mechanical, and absolutely terrifying. It was a unified block of colour that exuded a cold, disciplined menace. It held its ground, a silent promise of the violence to come. The British commanders, most notably the Duke of Wellington during the Napoleonic Wars, mastered this tactic. His men would often be positioned just behind the crest of a hill, hidden from enemy artillery. As the French columns, already tired from marching uphill, reached the summit, they would be suddenly confronted by this pristine, terrifying red line, rising as if from the earth itself. The order would come. Present. The front rank would kneel, the rear rank would level their muskets over their comrades' shoulders. A single, unified weapon. Fire! A thundering crash. A single sheet of flame and lead would erupt from the entire length of the line, ripping through the dense, packed ranks of the attacking column at point-blank range. The psychological shock, combined with the devastating physical toll, was often enough to shatter the attack completely. The Thin Red Line had held, its discipline and its uniform providing the cohesion to stand and deliver a fire that no column could withstand. But what about cavalry? A thin line of infantry was hopelessly vulnerable to a massed charge of heavy horsemen. Here, the Redcoats' cohesive power served another purpose. The command would ring out, "Form square." In a miracle of drill and discipline, the line would break, wheel, and reform itself into a living fortress. A hollow infantry square, 4 ranks deep on every side. The front rank would kneel, planting the butts of their muskets on the ground, their bayonets pointing outwards like the spines of a hedgehog. The ranks behind them would stand, ready to deliver controlled volleys. For a cavalryman, this presented an impossible obstacle. It was a solid block of red and steel. Horses, no matter how well trained, will not charge a solid, bristling wall of spikes. The red uniform, by allowing the men to find their places and form this complex formation in seconds, even in the smoke and chaos, was the key to this anti-cavalry defense. The line and the square, firepower and resilience. The redcoat was the master of the Napoleonic battlefield. For decades, this system was unbeatable. But the world was changing. The very technology that had birthed the redcoat was about to make it obsolete. But the world was changing. The very technology that had birthed the redcoat was about to make it obsolete. The mid-19th century saw 2 technological revolutions that would fundamentally rewrite the rules of war. The first was the rifled musket. For over a century, the smoothbore brown Bess had reigned supreme. But new innovations, like the French Minié ball, created a projectile that was easy to ram down a rifled barrel, yet expanded on firing to grip the spiral grooves. This spin gave the bullet stability and, for the first time, deadly accuracy, at ranges the brown Bess could not even comprehend. Suddenly, a trained soldier could reliably hit an individual man from 500 yards away and sometimes further. The second revolution was smokeless powder. In the late 19th century, new chemical propellants replaced black powder. With one invention, the dense, choking fog of war, the redcoats' primary tactical justification, vanished. The battlefield, for the first time in history, was clear. These 2 inventions, arriving almost simultaneously, created a lethal new battlefield. A battlefield where soldiers could see for hundreds of yards and hit what they could see. In this new, terrifyingly clear environment, the redcoats' advantages were instantly nullified. Its command and control visibility was no longer needed in the non-existent smoke. Its psychological dominance as a wall of red was irrelevant to a rifleman lying prone 600 yards away. In this new war, the bright red coat had become a fatal liability. It was a perfect, painted target. It was a death sentence, and the British Army knew it. The first warnings had come not from Europe, but from the fringes of the Empire, decades earlier. In 1848, the British Indian Army formed a new, elite regiment for service on the rebellious northwest frontier, the Corps of Guides. Their task was not to fight in massed lines, but to patrol the harsh, mountainous terrain of Afghanistan, acting as scouts and skirmishers. Their enemy was not the French regular, but the Pashtun tribesman, a superb guerrilla fighter often armed with a long-barreled Jezail rifle, a weapon with far greater range and accuracy than the army's smoothbore muskets. For these men, a red coat was suicide. The Corps of Guides was officially supposed to wear the traditional uniform, but their pragmatic officers, facing the reality of frontier warfare, quickly adopted a local solution. They took their standard white hot-weather drill uniforms and began dyeing them with local materials, sometimes mud, sometimes tea, sometimes mulberry juice. The goal was to create a drab, dust-coloured uniform that would blend in with the rocky brown terrain. The locals had a word for this colour, a Persian and Hindi word for dust. They called it khaki. This was not an official policy from the High Command in London. It was a desperate, life-saving field expedient, born from the hard-won experience of men who were being systematically shot from distance. It was a quiet, practical admission, on the very edge of the empire, that the redcoats' time was over. For decades, the army existed in this bizarre, contradictory state. The main army, the one that fought in the Crimea or paraded at Aldershot, remained wedded to red. It was the colour of Wellington, of Waterloo, of imperial glory. The Horse Guards, the army's high command, was steeped in tradition and fiercely resistant to any change that seemed to diminish the army's pageantry. But on the frontiers, in India, in Egypt, in the Sudan, khaki was becoming the unofficial standard for active campaigning. Soldiers would dye their own uniforms before shipping out, much to the disgust of their commanding officers. This institutional arrogance, this stubborn refusal to accept that the rifle and the clear battlefield had changed everything, could not last. The army was clinging to a past that no longer existed. This divide between glorious tradition and lethal reality was about to be exposed in the most brutal and humiliating way possible, on a lonely, flat-topped hill in South Africa. This institutional arrogance, this stubborn refusal to accept that the rifle and the clear battlefield had changed everything, could not last. The army was clinging to a past that no longer existed. This divide between glorious tradition and lethal reality was about to be exposed in the most brutal and humiliating way possible, on a lonely, flat-topped hill in South Africa. The place was Majuba Hill, the year 1881. The conflict, the First Boer War. The enemy was unlike any the British Army had faced before. The Boers were not a professional, state-funded army. They were farmers, pioneers, and hunters. They fought not in disciplined lines, but as individuals, masters of fieldcraft and marksmanship. They wore not a uniform, but their everyday drab farm clothes, shades of brown, grey, and tan that made them virtually invisible in the high, dusty grasslands of the Transvaal. And they were armed, not with old muskets, but with modern, accurate, breech-loading rifles. The British commander was Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley. He was a product of the old system, a man who believed in the inherent superiority of the disciplined British regular. Facing a series of setbacks, Colley devised a bold, decisive stroke to break the Boer siege of Standerton. He would seize the dominant strategic point in the region, the summit of Majuba Hill, the Hill of Doves. On the night of February 26, 1881, Colley led a force of around 400 men, including companies of the 92nd Gordon Highlanders and the 58th Regiment, on a grueling night march. By dawn on February 27th, they stood triumphant on the flat, open summit. They had achieved complete surprise. As the sun rose, the British soldiers looked down on the Boer camp below. They were victorious, and they were a perfect, unmissable target. The 92nd Gordon Highlanders, in their bright red doublet tunics, dark kilts, and white sun helmets, were silhouetted against the clear morning sky. They were a dash of imperial crimson on a brown and green hilltop, visible for miles. Down below, the Boers, seeing the Redcoats on the summit, did not panic as Colley had expected. They did not see a fortress, they saw a shooting gallery. Grabbing their rifles and bandoliers, the Boer commandos began their ascent. They did not march in lines. They moved in small groups, using every rock, every gully, every patch of tall grass for cover. They were hunters, and the British were their prey. On the summit, the British, trained for linear warfare, formed a scattered perimeter. They could see nothing. The Boers, invisible in their drab clothes, crept to within 500, 400, then 300 yards. And then, the picking off began. It was not a battle. It was a systematic execution. One by one, the Redcoats were magnets for the high-velocity rifle bullets. The officers, in their scarlet, were targeted first. The sergeants, trying to rally the men, were next. The British soldiers, exposed on the flat top of the hill, had no one to shoot back at. They would fire volleys at puffs of smoke, while the invisible Boer marksmen methodically dismantled their chain of command. Chaos set in. The British discipline, so effective on a Napoleonic battlefield, was useless. The men, seeing their officers and comrades fall from an unseen enemy, began to break. Major General Colley, a red and gold glint of authority, tried desperately to rally his men. He became the primary target. A Boer bullet struck him, and he was killed instantly. With his death, the British line, and the British will, shattered. The survivors fled in a desperate, panicked rout, scrambling and falling down the steep slopes they had so confidently climbed hours before. The Battle of Majuba Hill was not a defeat, it was a humiliation. The casualties were staggering. 285 British killed, captured, or wounded, for the loss of just 2 Boers. The lesson, written in the blood of Colley's men, was brutal, undeniable, and final. The red coat, the symbol of British invincibility for 2 centuries, was a fatal anachronism. In a war of rifles and smokeless powder, it was nothing more than a shroud. The news of Majuba sent a shockwave through the British Empire. The War Office, its traditionalist arguments now indefensible, could no longer ignore the reality from the field. The Redcoat era was over. The news of Majuba Hill was more than a report of a battle lost. It was a eulogy for an era. The image of the 92nd Highlanders, redcoats silhouetted against the sky, being systematically hunted by invisible riflemen, was seared into the British military psyche. The humiliation was absolute. Back in London, the Horse Guards, the bastions of tradition, could no longer defend the indefensible. The romantic arguments of regimental glory, of Waterloo, of the thin red line's psychological power, were now just empty words, soundly refuted by the cold arithmetic of the rifle. The redcoat was a symbol of glory, but it was also a magnet for bullets. The change, however, was not immediate. Great institutions do not pivot. They turn, slowly, and with great reluctance. The British Army did not simply abandon red and embrace khaki overnight. To do so would have been too great a shock to its identity, too swift an admission of failure. Instead, the 1880s and 1890s saw the British Army fracture into two distinct versions of itself. A split personality emerged, defined by geography. At home, in Aldershot, or on the parade grounds of London, the redcoat lived on. It was relegated to home service and ceremonial duty. Here, the pageantry was everything. Young soldiers, barely out of training, would still be issued the thick, scarlet wool coatee. They would drill in it, stand guard at Buckingham Palace in it, and march in perfect crimson lines for the Queen's review. It was the army of appearance, the symbol of imperial might, preserved as a living museum piece. But thousands of miles away, on the frontiers of the empire, the real army, the one that fought and died, was undergoing a rapid, practical transformation. The lessons of Majuba were immediately applied to the next colonial campaign. In the Mahdist War in the Sudan, British troops took to the field not in red, but in the functional, dust-coloured khaki drill. The War Office, in a grudging admission of reality, began the progressive adoption of khaki for all foreign and colonial campaigns. A soldier shipping out to Egypt or India would pack away his ceremonial red and be issued this new, shapeless, but life-saving, drab uniform. It had no proud facings, no gleaming buttons, no stiff collars. It was a loose cotton tunic and trousers, designed for heat and, above all, for concealment. This period saw the bizarre spectacle of two British armies, wearing two different uniforms, fighting two different kinds of wars. One, an illusion of past glory, the other, a grim acceptance of modern reality. This strange duality could not last. The final decisive test would come, fittingly, on the same battleground that had first exposed the redcoats' weakness, South Africa. When the Second Boer War erupted in 1899, it was on an industrial scale. This was not a small colonial skirmish. It was a full-scale, modern war. The Boers were still there, still masters of the landscape, and now even better armed. This time, there was no debate. There was no confusion. The entire British Army, hundreds of thousands of men shipped from across the globe, arrived in South Africa wearing one colour, and one colour only: khaki. For 3 years, the war was a brutal confirmation of the new age. It was a war of long-range rifle fire, of machine guns, of trenches, and of guerrilla tactics. It was a war where visibility was death and camouflage was life. Khaki was no longer an expedient. It was the single most essential piece of equipment a soldier possessed. The lessons were final. By the time the war ended in 1902, the argument was over. The War Office, now fully modernized, made its official decree. The khaki service dress became the standard combat uniform for the entire British Army, at home and abroad. The Redcoat era, a period of nearly 250 years, was officially over. The redcoat, born of economics, perfected in the age of smoke, and glorified at Waterloo, was now and forever a garment of the past. It would never again be worn in combat. Its new life would be one of pure ceremony, a vivid, scarlet ghost haunting the parade ground, a symbol of a chapter in history that was now violently and definitively closed. The red coat, now gone from the battlefield, was already passing into legend, and with that legend came the myths. The most romantic, the most persistent, and the most stubbornly incorrect is that the coat was chosen to hide the sight of blood. It's an appealing, if grisly, piece of battlefield psychology. The idea that a soldier, seeing his comrades wounded but not vividly bleeding, would be less likely to panic and break formation. It paints a picture of cunning 17th century commanders, already masters of morale. But the truth, as we have seen, is far more practical, and has nothing to do with blood at all. First, the premise is flawed. Anyone who has seen a wound on dark, heavy fabric knows that blood is not a bright, convenient scarlet. It is dark. On the heavy, madder-dyed wool of a private's tunic, it would quickly dry to a blackish brown or dark purple stain, just as obvious and grisly as it would on a coat of blue or green. The hiding blood theory is a modern invention, an attempt to apply a romantic warrior's logic to a decision that was, at its heart, purely logistical. To find the real origin, we must rewind the clock, past the age of rifles, past Waterloo, all the way back to the 1640s and the chaos of the English Civil War. The army that first wore red was not the globe-spanning force of Queen Victoria. It was Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army. This was a revolutionary concept, a professional, meritocratic, national army, paid for by Parliament, not by the whims of individual nobles. And a national army needed a national uniform. The task fell to Cromwell's quartermasters. They were not strategists. They were accountants and suppliers. Their job was to clothe thousands of men as quickly, as durably, and as cheaply as possible. They scoured the markets of England for a dye that was plentiful, resilient to weather, and above all, inexpensive. They found their answer in the humble root of the madder plant. Madder was a common crop. Its dye, a dull brick red or rust orange, was the cheapest and most widely available colour-fast dye in 17th century England. It was the colour of the common man's cloth. It was, simply, the most economical choice. The New Model Army was clad in Venetian red, not as a tactical decision, but as a fiscal one. The redcoat was born from a budget line. This economic reality defined the army for the next 250 years. The vast, anonymous ranks of the infantry of the line, the men who stood in the thin red line from Blenheim to Waterloo, wore this cheaper, plant-based red. But as the army formalized, this simple economic choice created a stark visual class system. Because there was another red, a better red. The officers, men who purchased their commissions and were expected to pay for their own extravagant uniforms, would not be seen in the same common cloth as their rank and file. They, along with the prestigious Guard regiments in London, wore scarlet. This vibrant, breathtaking colour was not the product of a root, but of an insect. It was cochineal, a tiny beetle harvested by the million from the cacti of the New World. The process to create the dye was complex and astronomically expensive. A scarlet coat was not a uniform. It was a declaration of wealth and status. It was the 18th century equivalent of a luxury car, a piece of finery that instantly separated the aristocratic officer from the working-class man in the madder red coat. This tale of two reds is the first and most fundamental truth of the uniform. The colour was not chosen to hide blood. It was chosen because it was cheap, and the shade of that colour a man wore was a direct reflection of his bank account. The most iconic uniform in history was, from its very inception, a product of pounds, shillings, and pence. This simple economic choice, however, would have a massive, unforeseen consequence. It would, by pure accident, provide the perfect solution to the single greatest problem of the 18th century battlefield. This simple economic choice, however, would have a massive, unforeseen consequence. It would, by pure accident, provide the perfect solution to the single greatest problem of the 18th century battlefield: the fog of war. We must, again, abandon our modern perspective. A 19th century battle was not a series of long-range duels fought on a clear field. It was a close-range, industrial slaughter, choked by its own byproduct: black powder smoke. Every time a cannon fired, it belched a cloud of white, sulphurous fog. Every time a line of infantry fired a volley, hundreds of muskets discharged at once, adding to the impenetrable haze. Within minutes of the first shots, the battlefield would be utterly obscured, blanketed in a thick, acrid, stinging cloud. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of sulphur and sweat. The sound was a deafening, continuous roar, a thundering crash that made vocal commands impossible beyond a few feet. In this sensory nightmare, an army was blind, deaf, and terrified. A general, on his horse on a nearby hill, could see nothing. His carefully laid plans, his thin red lines, and infantry squares were now just scattered groups of men, lost in a grey-white ocean. How could he command? How could he send reserves to a collapsing flank if he couldn't see the flank? This is where the cheap, madder red uniform became the most brilliant tactical tool of the age. Red, as it happens, is one of the most visible colours to the human eye, and it provided the sharpest possible contrast against the white-grey of the smoke. It was a beacon. The general, peering through his spyglass, was not looking for soldiers. He was hunting for colour. He would scan the roiling smoke for a flash of red. This was his command and control system. He could see that a block of red was holding the ridge, while a block of French blue was advancing through the valley. But one block of red looked like another. This led to the next innovation, codified in the Royal Warrant of 1751, the regimental facings. The cuffs, collars, and lapels of the red coats were turned back to show a unique lining colour. The 3rd Regiment had buff, the 24th had green, the 5th had a deep blue. Now, the general could not only see a friendly unit, he could identify which unit it was. He could see his buffs were wavering and order the green Howards to support them. The uniform, with its red coat and coloured facings, was a sophisticated visual language, allowing a commander to read the battle and direct his forces in conditions of near-zero visibility. Down on the line, the situation was even more desperate. For the private soldier, the red coat was a lifeline. Lost in the smoke, deafened by the noise, his face black with soot, his eyes stinging, his only job was to follow the man in front of him. The red back of his file leader was his only anchor, the only thing tethering him to his regiment and his sanity. For the sergeants and officers on the line, their scarlet coats made them instantly visible. Their job was to maintain the integrity of the thin red line, the key to their firepower. They would pace behind the ranks, screaming over the din, physically pushing and pulling men back into formation. They could only do this because they could see their men, a line of red ghosts in the mist. The uniform was not a passive garment. It was an active piece of technology. It was the visual glue that held the army's formations together. It allowed the British Army to remain a single, disciplined killing machine, while its enemies, lost in the same smoke, dissolved into confused, panicked mobs. This cohesion, this ability to stay in formation, was the key to the Redcoats' psychological power. The uniform was not just for its wearer or its general. It was for the enemy. This cohesion, this ability to stay in formation, was the key to the Redcoats' psychological power. The uniform was not just for its wearer or its general. It was for the enemy. Warfare, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, was as much a battle of morale as it was of lead. And the British Army had, somewhat by accident, weaponized a primal human instinct. The colour red is one of the most powerful signals in nature. It is the colour of fire, of blood, of poison, of warning. It is hardwired into the human psyche as a signal of danger, dominance, and power. The British military system took this primal fear and industrialized it. The uniform was not designed to make the individual soldier look terrifying. He was just a man, often a farm boy or an urban poor, pressed into service. The uniform was designed to make the formation terrifying. It erased the individual, subsuming him into a single, monstrous entity, the wall of red. Imagine again that French conscript, marching in his heavy blue column. He is advancing on the British position. He sees the line. It is not a collection of men. It is a single, unblinking crimson stripe drawn across the landscape. It is perfectly straight, perfectly silent, and perfectly still. It looks mechanical. It looks unnatural. It doesn't move. It doesn't shout. It simply waits, a solid block of menace. This was the cold, calculated power of the thin red line. It was a psychological dare. The British were so confident in their discipline, so secure in their formations, that they didn't need to hide. They stood in the open, in the most obnoxious colour possible, and challenged the enemy to come and break them. This wall of red was the backbone of Wellington's defensive tactics in the Napoleonic Wars. His reverse slope tactic, where he would hide his lines just behind a crest, amplified this shock. The attacking French columns would toil their way up the hill, tired, disorganized, and screaming their battle cries, only to be confronted at the very last moment by this silent, scarlet wall, rising as one from the earth to deliver a single, devastating, point-blank volley. The shock was as much mental as it was physical. This psychological dominance was even more pronounced against cavalry, the shock troops of the age. When the cry, "Cavalry," went up, the red line would transform. In a seemingly impossible feat of drill, it would fold in on itself, the drummers beating a frantic rhythm, the sergeants screaming, the men finding their places by instinct and by the red coats of their comrades. In under a minute, the line was gone, replaced by a living fortress, the infantry square. It was a four-sided hedgehog of red wool and glittering steel. The front rank knelt, bayonets angled outwards. The ranks behind stood, ready to fire. For a charging horseman, this was a nightmare. A horse is a prey animal. It will not, under any circumstances, charge a solid, spiked wall. And the colour of that wall mattered. The bright, hot red, a colour unnatural in a green field, made the wall seem more solid, more alien, and more threatening than a block of blue or grey ever could. The wall of red told the horse's primal brain, danger, do not advance. The square was a triumph of psychology, a perfect fusion of formation and colour, and it was the infantry's ultimate defence. The red coat was, therefore, the complete package. It was an economic solution that became a command and control tool, which in turn became a psychological weapon. It allowed the British soldier to dominate the age of linear tactics, a perfect system for a world of inaccurate muskets and battlefield smoke. But this perfect, interlocking system was also a trap. It was a machine designed for a single purpose, for a single kind of war. And the world was on the cusp of a technological change so profound, it would shatter every one of the Redcoats' justifications, all at once. The very things that made it invincible would make it a death sentence. But this perfect interlocking system was also a trap. It was a machine designed for a single purpose, for a single kind of war. And the world was on the cusp of a technological change so profound, it would shatter every one of the Redcoats' justifications, all at once. The very things that made it invincible would make it a death sentence. Two innovations, arriving almost simultaneously in the mid to late 19th century, rewrote the laws of warfare. First, the rifled musket, like the Minié, and later, the Martini-Henry. These weapons, with their spiraled barrels, gave a single, trained infantryman lethal accuracy at 500 yards and beyond. The age of 80-yard volleys was over. The age of the individual, long-range marksman had begun. Second, smokeless powder. This chemical propellant replaced black powder, and with it, the fog of war vanished. The battlefield, for the first time in centuries, was horrifyingly clear. In this new, clear, long-range battlefield, the Redcoats' entire logic was inverted. Its every strength became a fatal weakness. Its visibility, once a vital tool of command, was now a shoot-me sign. Its psychological power, the wall of red, was irrelevant to an enemy you couldn't see, hiding in a trench 800 yards away. The very cohesion it provided, the tight, thin red line formation, was no longer a strength, but a target-rich environment. The redcoat was a tool perfectly adapted to a world that no longer existed. And the British Army, steeped in the glory of Wellington and Waterloo, was dangerously slow to realise it. The final brutal lesson came on February 27, 1881, at the Battle of Majuba Hill in South Africa. Here, Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley led his men, including the 92nd Gordon Highlanders, to the summit of a hill. They wore their red coats and kilts. As the sun rose, they were perfectly silhouetted against the sky. Below them were the Boers, farmers and hunters, clad in their drab, earth-toned farm clothes and armed with modern rifles. They did not form lines. They used the terrain, hiding behind rocks and in tall grass, invisible. What followed was not a battle, it was a hunt. The Boers, from hundreds of yards away, began the systematic picking off of the red targets on the hill. The British, trained to fire volleys at massed enemies, had no one to shoot at. They could only die, one by one, their red coats a perfect aiming point. General Colley himself was shot and killed. The defeat was a catastrophe, a national humiliation. Majuba was the death knell of the redcoat. The army, shocked into action, began the progressive adoption of a drab, dust-coloured uniform that had first been field-tested in India as early as 1848. The locals called it khaki. When the Second Boer War began in 1899, the lesson had been learned. The entire British Army arrived in khaki. By 1902, the redcoat was officially and permanently retired from combat. Its story is not one of folly. It is a powerful parable of technological evolution. The redcoat wasn't stupid. It was brilliant. It was the perfect, logical and lethal answer to the specific problems of its age: the inaccurate smoothbore musket, the smoke-filled battlefield, and the necessity of linear tactics. It was an interconnected system of economics, command, and psychology. And when the technology of war changed, that entire system shattered. Today, the redcoat lives on. It has left the battlefield for the parade ground. It is a scarlet ghost, a symbol of history, pageantry, and tradition. It stands guard at the Tower of London, a brilliant, living reminder of a time when war was fought shoulder to shoulder, in a wall of red and in a cloud of smoke. Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please hit the like button, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you in the next video.